Hello. Number ngadu dile Tsering geji pyogi shunge tsokjen ki nin sumba thang thama de cha de yu thoma dele ya mixel tsokdu ngaba de onzu shugin jushi ni shudu ki legu pekap timde ne peden ne bab delje chedar chegyo ba sheba de yin lerim the Tamshi nangin the Kreddha Tsokbe Genzin Kushep Michael Walt Van Praag layin. Good morning to you all. Today is the day 3, last day of the International Tibet Youth Forum. We will begin with the special session 5. The topic for the session is Narrative of Tibet's Legal Status for Advocacy. WeTag member from California, Tsering Choedup, will moderate the session. And our speaker for the session is Executive President of Kreddha, Dr. Michael Walt Van Praag. I request the two of you to please take the stage. Yes. I request Michael to please light the butter lamp.
Hello. Unzu schöne Diener. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the special session 5. And today's topic is narrative of Tibet's legal status for advocacy. And we have Dr. Michael Van Praag, who's going to speak on this topic. As we all know that Beijing has effectively changed how the international community perceives the Sino-Tibet conflict. And as a result, the governments are now, they act in accordance with their assumption that Tibet and the Sino-Tibet conflicts are China's internal affairs. For the Tibet movement, international advocacy to have a chance to success, we will need to shift the paradigm that has fundamentally changed the international community's assumption and approach by engaging with and educating all your interlocutors on the true history and international legal status of Tibet. As long as government officials, the media, and the general public are under the impression that Tibet is China's internal affairs, and that Tibetans are the Chinese ethnic minorities, their hands are tied and no meaningful actions beyond criticizing China's human rights records will be taken. Dr. Michael Walt Van Praag is an international lawyer, mediator, and advisor in interstate peace processes and professor of international law and international relations. He served as UN senior legal advisor to the foreign minister of East Timor during country's transition to independence, and as legal advisor to the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama from 1985 to 2011. He was appointed visiting professor of modern international relations and International Law at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton from 2011 to 2015, and taught at universities in Rome, Delhi, San Francisco, and Monterey. From 1991 to 1998, Michael served as General Secretary of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organizations, headquartered in The Hague. He has practiced law, including public international laws, with the law offices of Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, now Wilmer Hale in Washington, D.C. and London, and of Petit and Martin in San Francisco. His publication includes Tibet Brief 2020, co-authored with Mick Bolhurst in 2020. Sacred Mandates, Asian International Relations since Genghis Khan, co-authored, edited with Timothy Brooks and Mick Bolhurst in 2018. The implementation of the rights to self-determination as a contribution to conflict prevention, reports of the international conferences of experts, 21st to 27 November 1998. UNESCO Division of Human Rights, Democracy and Peace, UNESCO Center for Catalonia, Barcelona, 1999, and The Status of Tibet, History, Rights, and Prospects of International Law, Westview, 1987. As global power shift is pretty much in favor of Tibet today, so there is definitely a need for the shift of narration, especially all of us are member of now WTEC, and our responsibility and a duty, being again a citizen of our own respected nations, we will go and meet with our elected representatives, and today's topic is more in line with that and how we're going to change the narratives. I'll request Dr. Michael to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsering Choedup, for the somewhat too long of an introduction about me. And thank you, DIAR and the DIAR team, for organizing this excellent conference. Really, I know, because I've organized, or I've helped to organize a number of conferences, how difficult and how much work goes into it. And you only notice how much work it is when it doesn't go well, when it's not smooth. And this has been a smooth, seamlessly organized meeting, and thank you so much for inviting me and being part of it. In particular, for being able to meet with so many new friends and a number of very old friends. Thank you very much. Let me just start a little further away from my mouth. Is that better? Excellent. So let me just start with a very brief personal story, because it is relevant to this meeting, but also because I thought about it because Sikyong Pemba Tsering introduced me a little bit 2 days ago, and with a little bit of a, I think, a confused start. So I also want to correct it. So my initial involvement with Tibet started when I was 11 years old, and I had read some books, felt very moved and compelled to do something about the injustice that Tibet had suffered and the Tibetan people had suffered by the invasion of Tibet. And so I wrote a letter to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and said, as kids can do when they're young and very single-minded and purposeful and not knowing the realities of the world, that I was going to do something about this. And Tenzin Geshe-la, who was here a couple of days ago as well, and was at the time Secretary of His Holiness, wrote a very polite letter back encouraging me and kept me informed about what was happening in Tibet in the years that followed, not realizing that he was writing to a very young school kid. Then some years later, in fact, almost to the day in this month, July of 53 years ago, I came to Dharamsala, age 17, met with His Holiness, and had an extraordinary audience that lasted 4.5 hours, during which time His Holiness expressed, among other things, a keen desire to visit the West. And so 1.5 years later, after I came out of 1.5 years of army training, which we all needed to do in the Netherlands, I offered to His Holiness that I could explore whether there was a possibility of such a trip in Europe. And His Holiness asked me to do so, and armed with a letter that authorized me to undertake this exploration, I traveled throughout Western Europe, met with officials of foreign ministries, with well-connected people, with organizations who might help in the case of such a visit. And probably to your surprise, given how much His Holiness has traveled since then, the response that I got from all governments and from all people who were in the know was that no, such a visit was not possible. At that time, it would have been an unprecedented visit. It hadn't happened before, and these governments all feared the reaction of China. And so the answer was simply, this is not the right time, it is not possible. And only because I was only 17, and I felt I didn't want to take no for an answer, persevered with creative advocacy, with sometimes playing one government against the other. After 1.5 years, or a little bit less than that, perhaps 9 months already, I managed to get 1 or 2 governments and then 11 governments to accept a visit by His Holiness, 2 of which received His Holiness officially, the government of Ireland and the Vatican, the Pope. And the others all allowed His Holiness to visit the country. Some senior officials met His Holiness as well. Now, I'm telling this story for 2 reasons. One is because it shows that you don't need to take no for an answer in advocacy. That you should not be afraid of asking more than you think is possible when you're in the role of an advocacy. What is possible doesn't really require your help. What is not possible needs your full commitment and perseverance. And the other reason why I think this is relevant is because what it shows is that young people, that youth is a strength, not a handicap. Yes, experience can be useful, but youth has the ability to persevere and not to mind trying to cross boundaries. And in fact, there were only 2 people during that whole period that I was traveling around Europe and trying to convince governments, 2 people that supported me. And each of them had as their logic for supporting me, they said, we don't believe it's possible, but if it happens, it's going to be because a young person who doesn't take no for an answer is simply going to persevere. That's how miracles happen, and that's why we support you. So this, I think, is the message to take to your friends and colleagues. They don't need to be 17, they can be 21 too, and they can be 35. But youth really has its strength. So, we've talked about the fact that there is a change in atmosphere in relation to China in the international community today, and that we should take advantage of this change that is going to help in advocacy on Tibet. And that is undoubtedly true, and I think it's a great inspiration for us. At the same time, Tibet's been occupied now for 70 years, and many people that we meet are essentially discourage you because they say, well, you know, this is China is such a big power. There is so little that one can do against it, and therefore there's not much chance of things really changing in a major way. Well, I have news for these people. The only certainty that we have in life is that everything changes. And dictatorships end, empires end, change comes. It's the only certainty we have. The question, of course, is when. The question, of course, is how these changes occur. But in my experience, and I've worked with a number of movements very much like the Tibetan movement, and I mentioned two because they're very similar in particular, that is the Baltic states and East Timor. When change occurs, it occurs in unexpected ways and at unexpected moments. In relation to East Timor, it happened because of an economic crisis which hit Southeast Asia, and it also hit Indonesia, and so the government fell, a new government came to power, and for a very brief time, that government was open to ideas, but also to international pressure. And then it closed up again. And the East Timorese were well organized, well prepared. And so they used this opportunity to get the support that they needed from the UN, from the international community, and they have achieved their independence. Baltic states, as you know, it was the breakup of the Soviet Union that caused the complete change and created an opportunity. Today that would not be possible under Putin. But during that time, again, a brief period was an opening. And the people in the Baltic states, their parliaments, their resistance movements were very, very well organized. And they were able not just to take to make use of the opportunity. They were actually, and this is something many people don't know, they were actually very much one of the principal causes of the breakup of the Soviet Union. So they both engineered the breakup of the Soviet Union and they took the opportunity when the moment was right. So why am I saying this? Because when change occurs, you, the entire Tibet movement, needs to be prepared. Because the opportunity that will arise will not last long, perhaps a question of months. And if you are well prepared, you can take advantage of it and do what you need to do at that time. If you're not well prepared, like many others that I've seen, Aceh in Indonesia, West Papua there as well, and many other movements, the opportunity passes and it's too late for them to make any use of it. So my main message is to really be prepared. And so the question is, what are some of the things that need to be done in order to feel that you're prepared for any opportunity? And at the same time, use the kind of less radical opportunity that exists today of the atmosphere in relation to China to make advances already and to prepare already. And this is how we get to the narrative. Because 70 years ago, 60 years ago, even 30 years ago, or 25 years ago, people knew that Tibet was an independent country that was invaded, that was occupied, that China had committed aggression. And yet today, most people don't. Today, even officials at foreign ministries that are specialized in Asia are not really certain what the status of Tibet was. They believe that Tibet probably had, in some way, was part of China before 1951. And that is the result of very effective Chinese propaganda spreading a historical narrative whereby Tibet has always been, or at least since ancient history, has been part of China. And this is a rather complicated narrative that requires you to believe that China itself has existed for thousands of years, which most people in the world believe, because we've been conditioned to believe that. And it requires you to believe that the Mongols who conquered China and subjected it to their rule were actually Chinese, because the Mongolian Empire was Chinese. Genghis Khan today is referred to in China as one of the great sons of China, and that the Manchus who conquered China and ruled it for many years were Chinese, and therefore that whatever relations they had with the Tibetans was actually a relationship between China and Tibet, which is not true. So for about 10 years, Mick Boltius and I did research with, and we engaged for this research, or we engaged with for this research with more than 100 scholars around the world at different universities, different seminars that we organized, etc., to understand Inner and East Asian history and political relations since Genghis Khan, but also to specifically to understand Tibet's position within this greater East and Inner Asian history. And the result was one book that you mentioned, Tsering, which is Sacred Mandates, International Asian International Relations since Genghis Khan, a book that is now being used in universities. And the other book is this one, which is Tibet Brief 2020, which I think a number of you have read. And Tibet Brief 2020 doesn't refer to the year. There's a slash. It refers to 2020 vision, clear vision. So it's a clear understanding, clear vision of Tibet. We're going to have to change the title because too many people get confused. But this is why also there is this little thing that when you go to the eye doctor, you see whether you have clear vision. If you can read the bottom one there, then you have clear vision on Tibet. Now, in this book, we look at the Chinese narrative and then respond to it systematically. And the outcome of our research is very simply this, and it surprised even me, who had done research on Tibet before, had written a book on it before, etc. That is very simple. Tibet actually was never a part of China. And this is crucial. I mean, even if it had been part of China for a century or two, it doesn't matter in terms of its modern status. But it is quite striking that China should create a narrative whereby Tibet has always been a part of China, whereas in reality it never was. And most importantly, when China invaded Tibet, Tibet was an independent country. It fulfilled all the criteria for an independent country in the modern sense of the term. And what that means is that China's invasion of Tibet was one of the most fundamental violations of international law. The attempt to acquire territory through the use of force. We all see it today with what's happening in the Ukraine. The world is not entirely united, but strongly of the opinion that indeed it is one of the most fundamental violations of international law to aggress another country. It's one of the bases for the United Nations. And the consequence of that is that the annexation of territory through the use of force is illegal, and therefore you cannot annex territory by the use of force. What does that mean for Tibet? It means that China did not obtain sovereignty over Tibet by its invasion of Tibet and by its 70-year rule of Tibet. And this again is something that many people don't realize, that simply the fact that China has effectively ruled Tibet for 70 years does not mean that Tibet has become a part of China. Of course, on the ground reality is that China rules it, that Tibet is not free. But legally speaking, Tibet is an illegally occupied country. It is still a country. And China has no legitimate right to rule Tibet. Now, as I say, 70 years ago and even 30 years ago probably, many people, or if not most people, were aware of this. Today, very few are. And this has some very serious consequences. Now, you all know that, especially around the early 2000s, but particularly after 2008, after the Olympics and China's great feeling of pride that everybody bowed down to them when they came to the Olympic Games, plus the fact that there had been uprisings in Tibet, which challenged their authority in Tibet. I think the combination of those things resulted in China putting many, many countries under pressure to make specific statements that they consider Tibet to be a part of China. And many countries have done that. What this means, that there is a kind of general sense that Tibet is part of China, and you see this reflected in the media as well. Tibet gets referred to as part of China. One of the consequences is that what happens in Tibet is seen as the internal affair of China. It is not the responsibility of the international community to interfere in what happens in Tibet, except on the issues of human rights. But that's a very limited area in which governments feel they have a right to protest, to complain about human rights violations, regardless of where it occurs in the world. And so this is why you see that most governments do say something about human rights violations in Tibet, and that when you go to a foreign ministry, most likely you get met by somebody who has authority to discuss human rights, but not any political issues. And so how do we shift from this paradigm to a paradigm where governments understand and act on other issues than only human rights, but also on the political question, and how to resolve the political question? For that, we do need to go back and recuperate the truth, respond to and contest the false Chinese narrative. So history is not just a thing for academics. It has immediate consequences for the rights and the position of Tibet today. If Tibet was part of China, you are a minority of China. You're actually Chinese, but you don't really know it. If Tibet was independent at that time, you are part of a country that is occupied and that has some very important rights. You have the right to restoration of your independence. You have a full right to self-determination. You have a right to, or put it this way, the international community, the governments that many of you are a part of the other countries as well in your citizenship, they have a duty to help resolve the China-Tibet conflict under international law. And so it changes the nature of what you can expect from the international community, what they're supposed to do, and the view of the legitimacy or the illegitimacy of China's rule of Tibet. And so today, China has no legitimacy in Tibet under international law. But again, the problem is that most people don't know that. The problem is also that most governments do not want to act on it or even admit it because it is not comfortable. And some government officials use these very words. When you ask them to do something, they will say, that is not comfortable. China will get angry. We don't want to do this. And so getting back to the original story that I said, it is necessary to push them to go beyond what is comfortable. And that's your role. They need to go beyond what's comfortable to what is right, and to what is going to change, and to what is their obligation. And to do that, you can also help them by showing them that it's actually in their interest to do that. In other words, this is not a hostile move on your behalf. If you're a citizen of Germany, you can show how it is in the interest of that government, but also of your own country to do that. And you can do that today, just to give an example, by raising the point that because this is something that is so much in the conversation, international conversation today, by pointing to the importance of maintaining and supporting the international rules-based order, or the international law. If the country that you're talking to, the officials that you're talking to, are actually violating international law themselves by not acting as they should in relation to Tibet, then how can they be supporting international law elsewhere and preventing it from being violated elsewhere? So it's in their own interest to act in accordance with international law. And what you are doing is helping them to do it and trying to find a way to do it. The other thing is, for example, to place yourself very squarely on the side of this struggle that is being presented by a number of countries in the West as being that between democracy and autocracy. And you are struggling for freedom against the biggest autocracy in the world. So is it not in their interest to support this struggle, if it's part of the greater struggle against democracy and autocracy around the world? So these are just examples, but there's ways to make it in their interest to support you. Now, advocacy that we've discussed here, I think most people are thinking of advocacy in terms of meeting with government officials, with parliamentarians, members of US Congress, etc. But advocacy is not just that. It is also advocating with the media, developing relationships with journalists and educating them so that they reflect the truth about Tibet, so that they don't refer to Tibet as part of, the westernmost part of China or the southwest of China or terms of that kind. That they don't refer to Tibetans as an ethnic group or a minority of China. Because you're not a minority. You're a country, but you're also a people. And peoples have, in international law, stronger rights than minorities. Minority is an internal affair of China. A people has the right to self-determination, to determine, in other words, its own political status, its own economic, social, and cultural development, free of outside interference. That's the definition, the United Nations definition of self-determination. As a people, you have it. And so it's important to be identified as a people and not as a minority. But it also means you should not use that language. But also, advocacy is correcting when others use language or terms or describe Tibet in mistaken ways that have implications. So that's with the media, but also in universities, it's advocacy. Bring the knowledge about Tibet in universities if you can, in schools, with NGOs, in communities, etc., at very local level, but also, of course, with parliamentarians and with government officials. And as I say, language is very important. So minority is one word, and there's many more words. Don't talk about the Tibetan issue. This is the most ambiguous word you can use. What it emanates is that you're insecure and uncertain about what the issue is really about, because it's just an issue. It's not an issue, it's a conflict. And the fact that many people feel uncomfortable about the use of the word conflict is because of its meaning. It means it's between two countries, two entities in this particular case. Don't talk about China when you're actually meaning the Yuan dynasty or the Qing dynasty. They're not China. But we're so used to talking this way because we're being conditioned to do that. Not just by the communist Chinese, but even before that. In universities, we've been conditioned to think about this continuous existence of China. But don't do it. Be accurate. Talk about the Qing, or talk about the Manchu Empire and about the Mongol Empire. Don't ask, and I've heard some people do it, don't ask for China to give you human rights. You have those human rights. They are yours. Nobody needs to give them to you. What you do need to demand is the free exercise of those rights, is an end to the violation of those rights. It's the same with self-determination. You have it. Nobody needs to give it to you. It's not a question of whether you should have it or shouldn't have it. You have it. Question is, you need to be allowed to freely exercise it. It's an exercise of choice. That's all it is. And so I think that at this point, in order to recalibrate, if you like, in order to reframe the advocacy, it's important to move from a asking for favor type of advocacy, please can you do this because it will help us, etc., to an advocacy that is rights-based, that is based on the strengths of the Tibet, of your cause, which is the status of Tibet as an occupied country, and which is the rights of the Tibetans, which need to be brought back to the attention of people, but they've recognized the right to self-determination already at the UN in 1961, and don't forget that. And there's a reference to it indirectly again in 1965 by the General Assembly of the UN. And you can look up which countries voted in favor of it. And I bet that all the countries that are represented here voted in favor of it. So you can make an appeal to your government also that they should live up to their own commitments. And then finally, what in the past couple of years, when I've been meeting with officials of foreign ministries and also with parliamentarians, what I've asked is that they recognize that they adopt a policy of non-recognition of Tibet as part of China, just as they are very firm in adopting a policy of non-recognition in relation to Russia's annexed territories in the Ukraine. Everybody agrees that you should not recognize that, but they should apply the same standard to Tibet. Now, I realize, and I expressed that in my conversations to them as well, I realize that it's difficult to change your policy overnight. But there are steps that can be taken. And the first one is not to make any more statements that Tibet is part of China, and not to act or say things that imply that that country considers Tibet a part of China. In other words, silence is itself an important message. And acting in a way that does not indicate that you recognize Tibet as part of China is also a very important message. And it's a step in the direction of non-recognition policy. Receiving the Sikyong and other officials of the Central Tibetan Administration in particular ways that indicate that you see them as legitimate representatives of the Tibetan people is an important signal that moves towards non-recognition that Tibet is part of China, because there are these other legitimate representatives there. And this is already happening a little bit. And so I'm very optimistic that we're moving in the right direction, and we don't see it immediately, but it is moving in the right direction. And now finally, to close, I'd like to just show a couple of slides to indicate also how this relates to efforts to try to resolve the conflict of Tibet. Are they up? And they're in the sense of trying to understand how we came to the place now where there is such a gap between Tibetan rights and how it is perceived internationally. Next slide. So these are the ranges of possible statuses for Tibet under international law. So it's somewhat theoretical, but these are the statuses that are available to Tibet, maybe not in a practical sense, because you can't just say, I want this, but these are the kinds of statuses. With most decision-making power, with, of course, independence, full independence at that end. And here with the least amount of decision-making power for Tibetans, which is the full integration of Tibet into China, assimilation of Tibetans as Chinese, essentially. And then there's all these different possibilities in between, with free association where only foreign affairs and defense are with Beijing, to a confederation of some sort, two distinct entities that agree to do certain things together, but they each keep a certain amount of sovereignty to themselves. The one country, two systems kind of autonomy that you've seen in Hong Kong, but as it was originally conceived in the agreement between Britain and Hong Kong. We all know that that's being eroded and taken away. But the original concept was a very strong type of autonomy, where Hong Kong maintained its own political and economic systems different from China. It was going to become democratic, which is not what's happening in China. And then you have the robust, what I call robust autonomy, which means political and territorial autonomy. And if you apply that to Tibet, that also means one single autonomous region for all of Tibet, all three regions of Tibet, within the scope of the PRC constitution, but regardless of what article it might fall under. You know, the Hong Kong one fell under Article 31, which means the government can designate an area as a special area with any kind of status it wishes to give it. That could be possible for Tibet, but it could also perhaps fit in a different way in a slightly modified constitution of the PRC. clear allocation of powers between central government and the Tibetan government, and some constitutional or international guarantees for that autonomy. That's what is a robust autonomy, and that is more or less what the middle way approach is trying to obtain. Cultural autonomy is much less of an autonomy because it's only in cultural, religious, language issues. It is not a political autonomy, it's not territorial autonomy, so it can go across borders. Autonomy, nominal autonomy is essentially what Tibet has today. It is autonomous region in name and autonomous areas in various other Chinese provinces in name, but in reality all decision making is with Beijing, not with Tibetans. And then of course the full integration. Next slide please. These are the milestones in Tibet's, if you like, decline of autonomy, decline of decision-making over the period since its independence to the 17-point agreement, which was a very strong kind of autonomy where only foreign affairs and defense was with Beijing, and Tibet had its own system, its own government, its own decision-making power on everything else. But following the 1959 national uprising, the Tibetan government was abolished by Beijing. Of course, it continued to operate in exile, but for Beijing's purposes, it no longer exists. All decision-making was with Beijing. In '65, the Tibet Autonomous Region was established, and the political autonomy was essentially hollowed out. So that's the kind of nominal autonomy that we were talking about was established at this time. With the Cultural Revolution, even that was destroyed and taken away. 1980, Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Hu Yabang, went to Tibet, and many of you will have read how he apologized for what had happened in Tibet and wanted to restore autonomy to a certain degree in Tibet and give Tibetans more decision-making power. But he didn't survive very long. 2 years later, a new constitution in the PRC. 2 years later, the regional ethnic autonomy law, all of which in a sense limits the autonomy, even though if you read those laws, it gives the impression it's giving a lot of autonomy. But in reality, everything boils down to that all decision-making power is subject to approval or decision-making by the central government. And in effect, and this is again something that is not very well known, in effect, the autonomy that Tibet and the two other autonomous regions enjoy is less than the autonomy that the provinces of China enjoy. They have more autonomous decision power than Tibet, even though they don't have the name autonomy. And then today, what we're finding is Beijing's declaration of policies of full integration of Tibet and assimilation of the Tibetans into one China, one nation, one language, one culture. Next, please. And this is just the visual of what I just said now, with the years and the decision-making power clearly going down to this corner, one nation, one culture, one language policy, which is what the current policy seems to be. Next. And so this is the proposed middle way outcome, if you like, that the CTA has proposed to China, right? Genuine autonomy within the scope of the constitution, single autonomous region for all of Tibet, clear allocation of powers between Beijing and Lhasa. Mainly it comes down to foreign affairs and defense with the central government, and most other matters with the government or with the authorities in Lhasa, and a dispute resolution mechanism if difficulties occur between the two. Next, please. And so the middle in the middle way approach is this area, more or less, between more decision-making power and less decision-making power, in the middle between Tibet's historical independence, occupied status, the Tibetans' right to self-determination, and Tibetans' desire for freedom and independence. And I mention these things not because I made them up, but because these are mentioned by His Holiness in the 5-point peace plan, in the Strasbourg proposal, which are the basis of the middle way approach. So he very clearly says that this is a middle between these things and the reality of the PRC's effective rule of Tibet, or control of Tibet. That's the reality on the ground. Its oppressive nature, which cannot continue, and the PRC's political objectives with Tibet to integrate it fully. And so that's where the middle is. Remember that now for the next slide, please. So what's happened is, in the perception of the outside world, governments, people, the press, and others, because in their perception, a reasonable and achievable middle way is the middle not between this and that, which is the Tibetan objective, but is a middle between what the Tibetan middle is, the stated objective of genuine autonomy, and this, which remains constant. And so now the middle has moved from here to here in the perception of the world. And this is why when you talk to officials and others, they simply assume that since Tibetans want genuine autonomy and the Chinese want this, a compromise somewhere between the two is going to be found here. And this really erodes, takes away from the whole purpose of the middle way approach, which was to end up somewhere here with a strong and robust autonomy. Next. This shows how the support of the international community for Tibet has changed over time. And I don't mean the quantity of support, because there's times in here that there was an outburst of support, and today there still is a lot of support, but the quality of the support, what is it they're supporting? Here they're supporting a complaint against China's aggression against Tibet, very political. Even the resolution on self-determination is political as well as human rights. Nobel Prize had a very strong political component. These, a little bit less, but still a lot. Even His Holiness's reception in Europe that I just talked about in 1973, a political gesture to allow him to come to Europe at the time. And this, of course, is the timeline, right? Then the resolution in the subcommission of the UN. Here, many governments declare support for the middle way approach. Governments call for negotiations, even throughout the dialogue process between 2000 and 2010. Many governments, either publicly or privately, expressed support for negotiated resolution. Then around 2008, as I mentioned, more and more governments start making statements that Tibet's part of China. Not that some had not done it before, but this is really the time when they make it. And some of them, even the US, Denmark, and France, saying that they do not support Tibetan independence, specifically. And then now governments treat Tibet as an internal affair with the exception of human rights. And so this is quite a drastic change over, of course, a very long period of time. And as I said, I'm optimistic because I think, and I hope in a couple of years' time, we'll be able to show that we're moving back in the right direction. And then the final couple of slides. So the question is, how do we regain strong international support to press for a fair and realistic solution to the Sino-Tibetan conflict that respects the rights and aspirations of the Tibetan people? In other words, how do we get back to where we were? And the answer is to denounce the PRC's false narrative and recuperate the truth, show what the situation really is in relation to Tibet, reassert Tibet's historical and present status as an occupied state, reclaim Tibet's rights, including that to self-determination, and re-anchor the aspirations and proposed solutions in all of these. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Michael La, and thank you for the detailed and enlightening presentation, especially in the context of international legal perspective. We have almost like half an hour. I would like to open the floor for question and answer. So
Hello.
I would appreciate if
Hello.
you raise your hand so that I can point out so that I don't miss people raising your hand.
Hello.
One down there.
There you.
Sorry,
Yeah.
this one there. You'll be next. Thank you.
Oh yeah. Tashtile Michael La. My name is Tenzin Dayul Hasawa from Vienna, Austria. And my question is, what do you have to say about the Tibetan people seeking independence? That's my question. Thank you.
It's their right to seek what they wish. It's not for me to say if a Tibetan individual or group wants to strive for independence or wants to strive for autonomy or wants to strive to improve the human rights of the Tibetans. That's for Tibetans to decide. But as I showed on the slides, there is an importance to a continued realization that there are Tibetans that wish for freedom in the form of independence or something close to it. In other words, again, His Holiness's original concept of the middle way was based on the realization which he expressed that Tibetans have a desire for independence, for freedom. That doesn't mean that that is your policy, that is what you ultimately are striving to get, but that there is this desire that exists. And I think there's no shame in saying that most people in the world want that kind of freedom. They want the freedom to make decisions about their own fate. And so it's that realization, I think, that should not be erased, so that the world still knows that this is something that lives among Tibetans, and therefore that the middle is genuine autonomy and is not less than that.
Okay.
My question is, I always wonder why, especially even some of our Tibetan scholars accept kind of Tibet has been part of China. This seems for me, before that CCP's aggression, it seems like, okay, in the past they have, aggression or occupation in Tibet times kind of legitimate, and then seems like we are accepting whether past in the Yuan or Manchu or whatever. It seems like in the past it's okay, but current that CCP is not okay. So why we negate that narrative? In the past, Tibet has been that kind of, suffer from aggression from those, and then we can counter that CCP as well.
Well, I don't know why. I think it's misinformation. I think it can be carelessness, or it can be that they really have a different opinion, which of course is possible. I mean, I'm not saying that I have a monopoly on truth, but I think it is based on an acceptance of a, long existing myth that that all of the rulers of China, all of these different empires, all of these different dynasties is the name that is used for Chinese empires. Why, I don't know, but that's the way it's used. That all of these dynasties, because they ruled China, were Chinese. And it isn't only the Chinese that feel that way, although Chinese really feel it deep-seated. You cannot convince the Chinese that the Manchu Empire was not Chinese, or that the Yuan was not Chinese. They feel that then you're robbing them of their history. So it's a very deep-seated thing. But I think that even in the scholarly world, these are referred to as China or Chinese. And so if there was a relationship between those and the Tibetans, there may also be Tibetans who think, well, that, what's the difference if I call it China or I call it Qing or something else? I think there's a fundamental difference. And don't forget that when the Chinese Revolution occurred against the Qing, against the Manchus, they were very clear, the revolutionaries, the ones that set up the Republic of China, that they were expelling the foreign rulers that were occupying them. In other words, at that point, they knew very well that this was not a Chinese dynasty. So I think it's very important. I think that it is important that people are very careful in the use of that kind of language. Also, the relation between the Manchu and the Tibetans was a relationship between the Manchu court and the Tibetan religious hierarchs, in particular the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama and some others. And as a result, with Tibet. But it wasn't first and foremost with the state Tibet, it was with the rulers of Tibet. And it was a religious political relationship that was based on the Tibetan worldview and the Tibetan legal order, not the Chinese one. This is a little complicated, but you can read it in the book. By the way, and this I would suggest also for certainly for advocates, for you, but also for some of these people that you say, so easily say Tibet was part of China in the past, and that's okay, but it isn't now. Read this book. I've got 7 copies, I think, with me, and I'm very happy to, I can't give them to you, but I can sell them to you for what it costs me to buy them, because authors don't get free copies anymore. So I have them here, and for $15 you can have them. But I say that because I think it is important for people who do advocacy to internalize the history. It's not just about reading it and saying, oh, okay, so that's the way it is. No. Read it and really internalize it so that you feel a sense of confidence when you talk about Tibet, and confidence that you can respond to the challenges and the pushback that you will get, because you get it all the time. I get it all the time as well. People don't take you seriously because they think that you're just, changing history to suit your political objectives. But if you speak with a sense of confidence, that is very different. And you can get that if you read this or similar books and really internalize it.
Next. Gisela here. And next. Die Jelle, Gisela.
I remember His Holiness saying that the problem with the Chinese leaders is they have mouth but no ear. They keep on lecturing us but not ready to listen to anything. So in this context, my question is how useful and meaningful and realistic to try to have dialogue with the Chinese government.
It's a very good question, and it's I'll give you my personal opinion. I mean, this is not reflective of anybody else's opinion. When I see how the present regime in China is behaving, Xi Jinping in particular, my sense is that his objective is to increase central control and party control over everything. Not to devolve any authority, not to provide more autonomy, but to take away any autonomy that is there and to concentrate all power and authority in himself. So from that perspective and from the way that he behaves, and he and his regime behave both inside the PRC, towards Uyghurs, towards Hong Kong, towards Tibet, but also how he behaves internationally. What His Holiness says about not having ears but only a mouth is entirely true in all of these cases. And so I don't see any reason why he would want to make any concessions in relation to Tibet. Whether or not he sees some usefulness in opening a dialogue, I would be very suspicious of the purpose of that dialogue, because I simply don't think that a fair and useful solution for Tibetans can be achieved with Xi Jinping the way he is behaving now. But as I said, everything changes. Things will change in China, and so there may be a time when there will be Chinese with ears as well as with mouths, and when it is possible to persuade them to change their relationship with Tibet and Tibetans. But as of now, I personally don't see much prospect.
Hello. Hello. Dr. Michael, thank you so much. First, I just had a quick comment. I worked at the White House for a few months, and while I was just taking a quick walk in the old Eisenhower building, your book was circulating there. So I think that's a huge impact that the biggest government officials in the U.S. is reading your material on Tibet. I just want to note that. My question is, do you see any? You mentioned that human rights is the one element that countries might speak out upon against China. Do you see any other issues, such as maybe climate change or sort of critical minerals mining, things like that, in the future that countries would speak against on China? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that comment. It's encouraging to know. And I hope more will read it. It's being translated it's going to be published in German in a few months' time, and it's being translated and published by the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Tibetan, and has been published in Italian, and so I hope that at least it also reaches those areas of the world where people do not necessarily read in English or easily read in English. And I hope it'll be translated more so. Anyway, yes, I think there's scope for, and there already is, for governments also speaking up on issues that are not political. And that includes climate issues, environmental issues, water rights, and perhaps some other things as well. But it doesn't address, even in terms of climate and environment, you know, one of the other rights Tibetans have as a result of their right to self-determination and as a result of the fact that they're an occupied country and that occupation law should apply in Tibet is that the natural resources of Tibet belong to the Tibetans and not to China. It belongs to the Tibetan people under international law. And so neither China has the right to use and exploit those resources for its own benefit. There's some question that they may be allowed to use them for the benefit of Tibetans, but not for their own benefit and profit. And other countries and businesses are not allowed to use those resources for their own benefit either. Now, that issue has not been addressed. And so when talking about the environment, I think that is something, again, to bear in mind if you're talking about rights-based advocacy, is to use that in the mix as well. And again, things don't change overnight. But planting it in people's minds already that this belongs to you, it does not belong to China, to dispose of Tibet's waters, to dispose of Tibet's minerals, and make batteries out of them, etc. That is something which sooner or later I think you may actually be able to use, but already you need to start planting it in people's minds.
Tuela, please. And then next you. Tuela.
Hello, just I have a very simple question, and I'm from CTA. As of now, we saw that China is above the law and their own law, like you mentioned in Article 31 and Article 4, because in Article 4 they have written that there is equality with the Han Chinese and Tibetan ethnicity and other ethnicities. And also in the 35 regarding the freedom of speech and publication and gathering and protest against China, and also in 36 like freedom of religion. So my question is how we can use the Chinese constitution law as a tool to against the China to advocate for Tibet.
That's very difficult. It's an excellent question, but it's a very difficult one to... I don't know the answer. I think Chinese lawyers would know the answer, because you really need to be a specialist in Chinese law to understand what Chinese law really means. There's a difference in use of the concepts and language between what we're used to in most of the world, and I don't mean only the West, India as well, and most of Southeast Asia, and most of the world, in Africa, everywhere, and how China uses these ideas. So, for example, when Chinese leaders keep insisting that everything is being done according to the law in China, that does not mean the rule of law. And people confuse the two. The way China uses according to law means according to the rules whereby decisions can be made by senior officials, and they have the authority to make those decisions, for example. And so for somebody who's not really specialized in the Chinese thinking about law and what it really means, to think they can use Chinese law to improve these things is very difficult. For example, if you read the Constitution and you read the autonomy law, you get the impression that all these rights to use of language and to culture and all these things are protected by the Constitution and by the autonomy law. That is not the case. If it was, then Xi Jinping and senior officials' statements today that Tibetans must learn in Chinese, that we're striving for one language, one nation, one culture, would be direct violation of the Constitution. But it isn't, because the Constitution and the law always has a little provision that says, in accordance with decisions of the central government or the party, or it always says in accordance with the law. It's strange for a law to say in accordance with the law, but it means, in other words, in accordance to where the authority lies to make decisions. And so the decision can be to be contrary to what we think the provision in the Constitution says, when we read it from our perspective. This is why in the memorandum on genuine autonomy that CTA gave to the Chinese government, it says, it talks about the protections, the principles of autonomy contained in the Constitution as we understand them. Meaning not necessarily as you understand them, you Chinese, because we don't know how you understand them. But the way we read them, they imply that it's protected.
Hello. Thank you, Michael. Good morning, Michael. I think the question will be same as, the context of the question will be same as the earlier question. In your presentation, you mentioned about what we are seeking is robust autonomy. The CTA proposing as robust autonomy. As far as I know, these all are, we are seeking something which is in the Chinese constitution. So we all know that China has a constitution, but not constitutionalism. I wonder, what if China rewrite its constitution? That what we are seeking now, if they completely change the constitution, is there any alternative ways that we can seek our robust autonomy, that what we are proposing now? Thank you.
I think you have, for today, I think you probably specifically should ask that question to the CTA. My understanding is that, and from reading the memorandum on genuine autonomy, which is the last document really that was given to the China, this is the last official detailed presentation of the Tibetan position. The solution that's being sought is within the framework of the Chinese constitution, meaning not outside of that framework. It doesn't mean in accordance with the constitution. It doesn't mean in accordance with the provisions of the constitution necessarily. It's within the framework of the Chinese constitution, within the framework of the PRC, if you like. But for example, I pointed to Article 31, which allows the government, and therefore, as a result of negotiations could result, to give a completely different status to Tibet than to any other quote-unquote part of the PRC, in accordance with what the two sides agree. Just as they did with Hong Kong. So, but you're right, if the constitution changes, then the constitution changes. But that is why it's important to have some guarantees, some mechanisms for the case that these things do happen. But the reality, again, under Xi Jinping, is that even if there is a special agreement under Article 31, as happened with Hong Kong, that he undermines it anyway. And so, again, today with Xi Jinping, it's a little difficult to conceive of a really robust autonomy that you can count on.
I thought that we would wrap this question and answer session, but since there's one person down there raising hand, so I would just like to kind of squeeze that in. Would you mind just, yeah, hello. Please. Down there. Mike here, please. Oh, is that you? Okay, please, go on.
Hello. So, Michael, the Chinese nation state weaponized the idea of a herd sentiment. So the Tibetan herd sentiment is not important, and
Can you speak a little bit slower and louder?
Yeah.
Thanks.
The Chinese nation state weaponized the idea of the herd sentiment. So the Tibetan herd sentiment is not important, and other herd sentiment is not important. Only the Chinese herd sentiment is important. So when we talk about the self-determination, and no any other nation, when we talk about the self-determination, that nation should be the colonized nation, and no in this country nation recognize the Tibet as a colonial illegal occupation. So whether it's the KMT or CCP, how do we fight both of these political parties through the international law? Thank you.
Can we squeeze in one more question from here?
Yeah, I didn't get the question.
Doctor.
But yes, squeeze another one in first.
Mike Data the question. That is last in the okay.
Yeah, thank you, Michael La. Your speech was phenomenal with a lot of details, and to me, and I'm sure a lot of my friends, it's an eye-opening, with very informative, and thank you so much. And my question is, where do you see Tibet in the next 5 to 10 years, knowing the current global political context? And in terms of the non-recognition policy, you recommended, or not necessarily, but talked about we can invite or receive Sikyong Lao or any other CTA representatives when they visit our city or our country. So what would be the best way to receive them in that context? Thank you.
So the first question I didn't really get. I'll have a conversation with him. And also tomorrow I'll be doing a workshop, and we can have more questions, and we'll be doing some role play of advocacy as well. So your question is, in the context of what I talked about, how can we best receive, for example, Sikyong and other senior officials of CTA? Well, let me give you an example. There's a country in Europe that after we had some very lengthy conversations at very high level with the foreign ministry to try to persuade them of what I've been talking about, of not recognizing Tibet as part of China, and that gestures in that direction would be helpful, etc. That country, next time that Sikyong came there, the foreign ministry received him with, at the foreign ministry, with a motorcade of motorcycles to take him to the foreign ministry. This is unprecedented. It's one thing for His Holiness to be received that way, because countries, governments generally say that it's because he's a religious leader, because he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, so they don't have to say that it's for political reasons. They can always hide behind His Holiness's religious eminence and Nobel Prize. But if it's unprecedented for a Tibetan purely political leader to be received this way. And so this, I think, is is a sign that we can change the tide, that we can move in that direction. But it's also a precedent that can be used for others to receive His Holiness. And it can be at local, for others to receive Sikyong. It can be at local level, by a mayor of a town, by state leadership, or at a national level in different countries. But in other words, the more the person is received, a senior Tibetan official is received, as would be received government officials of other countries, the better that is. And you will find that some countries are now receiving representatives, for example, of Taiwan, with more official receptions than before, because of this changed atmosphere with China. So if they can do it for Taiwan, and they still consider it a one China policy, they can do it for Tibet.
That's it.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Dr. La.
Thank you.
I would say that Dr. La has been more, I'm being humble, not really owning and telling the stories of all the successes that the visit of His Holiness Dalai Lama had in Europe beginning 70s. Let me just narrate a story from His Holiness Dalai Lama's visit to Rome. His Holiness was invited to the Vatican, and he received a state honor and a welcome that every political leaders of a state would get when they visit Vatican, with Swiss Army, in their colorful dress, would warmly welcome. So such was the welcome that His Holiness received as a head of religious leader and the head of exiled Tibetan administration at that point of time. That was a huge, huge success, and nobody ever received such welcome in Vatican thereafter, I guess, or even before. So thank you, Dr. La, for your intriguing and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you for dwelling into the historical importance of Tibet and its position in the context of Asian history, and also reiterating the fact that Tibet was never a part of China, and also this is something that the international legal perspective, and also it's according to international law, and the countries who accepts that Tibet is a part of China, again, as you mentioned, it goes against international law, which I guess is very important, especially for many of us who will go and meet our elected representatives in our own regions. So this will help in shaping our narrations. So thank you very much for that. And also for the minute detailed information, such as, the choice of our words, not using Tibet as an issue of Tibet, rather it's a conflict. So which I think it's very important, and I would really like to thank you for all these legal aspects that we will be helped, immensely in our pursuit back in our homes. And to wrap it up, let me just go back to what Kesa Genzela mentioned, where he said, he's really optimistic about China-Tibet dialogue based on 3 points that he mentioned. One is the situation inside Tibet, the Tibetan people's resistance and their bravery, and the second, the situation inside China, today's China's economic, political, and social situations, and third, the situation of CTA, the strength, which I think is the strength. And then based on that, as Kinzumla also yesterday mentioned about 3S, the structure, strategy, and stories. So we already have our structures, and now that, as Dr. Lai has mentioned about the strategies, and it's important, you know, whatever we do, it's all about narrating stories. So I think we have that strategy and stories for our work ahead. Thank you very much.